thank you also very much for inviting us to talk. We're very excited to share a sort of project that we started with you. And actually it links very well because earlier, of course, Susanna's keynote this morning was about cognitive benefits. And we've been hearing a lot about acquiring a language, language learning. And actually Aedin's and I are going to, presentation is going to actually look at the other end of the spectrum. And we're going to kind of be discussing various elements of arts-based and language learning and language, what happens with cognitive ability as we age. So actually looking at the other side of the spectrum. So dementia, bilingualism, and the insight into performance-based research. So a little bit, so this morning we already heard about like the cognitive benefits of bilingualism, and much has been said about that. Much research has been done into people becoming bilingual and what effect this has on a long-term basis. And what they found is that people have cognitive reserve, which means that on average, you show the signs of dementia or other age degenerative diseases 4 to 5 years later than monolingual speakers. So that's kind of the benefits, but then there's another element to this, and that is one of the things that we often speak about in bilingualism is like the executive control. Now, as you possibly can hear by my accent, I'm a native Dutch speaker, but I'm speaking to you in English. And that's because my executive control kind of pushes Dutch to the side and knows that, there's no point in speaking Dutch to you all because you know what I'm saying. But as you get older and as sort of, age degenerative diseases start to take effect, that executive control will actually disappear. And what you then get is people starting to mix languages, so something we call, translanguaging starts, maybe not consciously, but unconsciously. And as the disease progresses, actually we find that lots of these individuals revert to their first language. So the language they were brought up with, the language they spoke when they were young. And our research, our project kind of looks at some of the consequences of that and the wider implications for all involved. So although, this dementia has, how do you assess people that are bilingual? How do you communicate with people who have reverted to their first language, but might be a language you do not speak? And this is we've seen this recently in the Alzheimer's Society picking up on this about Punjabi families coming, having lived here all their lives, their children being first language English speakers, but whose parents might start using Punjabi. So that's one element, but we've also in Scotland minority language speakers, first language Gaelic and Welsh speakers. And we're going to be speaking about Gaelic speakers in a bit in this project. And some of the challenges, and actually what I've taken here is actually screenshots from a care home in the Netherlands, which has realized that the challenges that these people face as they get older, because caregivers may not speak the language, this might exacerbate some of the symptoms that people display when they get older. So they might get unsettled, they feel isolated, it contributes to loss of identity and feelings of isolation, not just of the people that are affected, but also family and caregivers. How do you connect to these people? And where we kind of come in, I think recently you might have seen this clip doing the rounds on social media about arts and song and music and the importance of bringing people back and for their personal welfare, how they respond to these cues. So whether they're linguistic, art, song, music. And these kind of have to be considered in the wider challenges that these people face and how we as a society deal with this, both to provide the best possible care, but also to ensure, how do the family members feel about this? How do caregivers deal with this? How do we conceptualize this in a wider sense? So we were part of a very exciting project called 5 to Midnight. And this is actually sort of looked at, looking at health and well-being and cultural language and preserving this, culturally appropriate care, but also art, music, song as a tool for exploration in the widest possible sense of the word. So we got some money from Solskjaer to look at put together a workshop called 5 to Midnight, Kun je zich aan, Remember Us. And Aedin is going to speak about it in a second. But what we were looking at is specifically the Gaelic context. Some of you might know Gaelic is a minority language in Scotland, and a quarter of all speakers live in the Western Isles, which is the island group colored dark blue in this picture. And one of the interesting aspects that has come to light as Gaelic has slowly disappeared from Scotland is that although Gaelic is spoken by young people, Gaelic is mostly, well, most people that can speak Gaelic are aged 30 and over. Younger people also can speak Gaelic, but as you can see in this slide, they don't tend to do it. And one of the things that I've researched, I'm a social linguist, is the fact that older people will speak to other older people in Gaelic, but to younger people, the language is typically English. And younger people under the age of 60, their first language typically is English. Now, this has implications for care. And if you speak to people at the Western Isles Health Board, they'll say that people end up in hospital, they get very confused. The caregivers, the nurses, the doctors, they don't speak Gaelic necessarily because they might not have been from the island. And it's very difficult sometimes to deal with these patients in the wider setting. So we kind of looked at a project, and I'm going to hand over to Aedin now to discuss it, where we brought all these different elements together, not just to discuss the context of Gaelic, but that was the context in which this project is set, but also to open it up to a wider audience. So I'll hand over to Aedin just now.
Okay, if you can leave that slide up, Ingeborg, I'll just explain before I get into the project my own role in Cuine Chichoring. So I'm not a Gaelic speaker. Nonetheless, as a long-time resident in Scotland and a taxpayer, I believe I'm part of what Michael Cronin refers to as civic patronage. So that notion that we are all responsible for providing support and advocating for the development and safeguarding of minority languages. And one of the ways in the past that I've sought to provide this support is through my teaching at the University of Stirling. And Stirling, as you may know, has no research or teaching staff employed at all in the area of Celtic languages. And there is really no linguistic presence of Gaelic either on the campus. But within my own field of translation studies, I have introduced my students to important theoretical debates on minority languages via a focus on particular sociolinguistic realities in Scotland and Ireland. And what I've noticed is that my students have consistently shown willing to engage with these questions and contexts. Many of them, and I would say this is particularly true of Scottish students engaging critically with Gaelic through the medium of English, admit to never having given much thought to the complex realities of diglossia that pertain in Gaelic-speaking Scotland. But what also struck me in many of the conversations I've had with students on the topic is the recurrence of two interrelated tropes, if you like, and I'll come back to those two in a moment. So on the one hand, we have the notion of language decline, and especially articulated through the idea of loss. So students may repeat points they have heard in public about Gaelic's historical loss of influence and point to that either regretfully or soberly as the reason, or even with hostility, as you probably can imagine, as the reason they don't speak the language. And depending on the perspective they have, notions of language loss can also translate into the argument that Gaelic has been lost, is dying, and will soon be irretrievably lost. And another recurring image that emerges from discussion with students is the notion of them being removed, whether in time or place, from Gaelic-speaking Scotland. Again, this can be expressed with regret, and particularly in the case of students who might have or are aware of a direct family connection to the language, usually through an older generation that may no longer be alive or may simply have failed to transmit the language to them. But other students will speak of what they see as the geographical remoteness of Gaelic-speaking communities. And this can come across as a perceived lack of connection with speakers of the language and a lack of knowledge or appreciation of anything distinctive about the place and its culture. And of course, it's ironic, as Ingeborg says, because most Gaelic speakers are now concentrated in the lowlands of Scotland and the Central Belt. So in the Stirling classroom context where I have taught, the sense of remoteness from Gaelic institutionally, but also understood by the students as geographic, seems to lead them towards a very narrow and fatalistic understanding of loss where the language is concerned. And this thinking can, in my experience, be very difficult to challenge. So what the slide here is illustrating for you is a workshop that Ingeborg and I and other colleagues organised in the summer of 2019, which was a performance-led workshop and a collaboration between a Glasgow-based theatre company called Toki and Strathclyde and Edinburgh and Stirling universities. And at the workshop, there you see at the table the professional actors doing a read-through of a draft of the play, sections of it. There were health professionals, representatives from charities and voluntary organisations, language scholars, medics, members of the public, caregivers, care providers, carers. And there were three primary focuses, I guess: bilingualism within the medical context, dementia and the bilingual community, particularly in the context, the very specific context of minority languages, and then dementia and the arts. And I suppose with this workshop, we all immediately saw a learning potential that would help students who were also present reflect not just on the very real sociolinguistic issues speakers of a minority language can be faced with, but also students' own thinking on a language and culture that they believe to be remote, not connected to them, and facing irreversible decline. So just let me quickly give you a synopsis of the play. It's provisionally titled 5 to Midnight. It portrays a late middle-aged couple living in Lewis, Mary and John Campbell. John is a monolingual speaker of English who met Mary when she was working in his native Glasgow. Following their marriage, they moved to the Western Isles where they had a son, William, now I would say in his 20s. Like his mother, William is bilingual, so she transmitted the language to him. He lives in the mainland now with his partner and baby daughter, and clearly there's a tense relationship with the mother. When the play opens, the audience is immediately forced to acknowledge what has been clear to John and other characters in the play for some time, and that is that Mary is showing symptoms of cognitive decline. So for example, she's uncharacteristically forgetful and irritable, and crucially, in John's presence, Mary is also starting to inhabit a world within their home that is exclusively Gaelic speaking and therefore excludes him. Apart from music, because she will sing in Gaelic. On the one hand, this world is real, and to a degree it's stable, because the play's other Gaelic-speaking characters can join her in this world and engage in conversation with her on her terms. At the same time, Mary's monolingual world within the home is unreal and unstable, because John's presence reminds us that Mary is, or at least was, bilingual, and this fact underpinned the life they share together and with their son. But what's interesting about the plot of the play as it unfolds is that whilst it undeniably nods to the fact that Mary's fate is on an irreversible course, it's more interested in family dynamics and communication at a point when Mary's condition still allows her an active speaking role. So looking back, I think Ingeborg, I might ask you to move on to the next slide. What did we learn about the project and the workshop in particular and its value? This is what I want to talk about for the remainder of my contribution. So above all, the read-through of the play recovers the experiential immediacy of individuals as they deal with dementia and its impacting on their understanding of themselves, as well as their role within the family. And the embodied nature of performance is key here for countering remoteness and creating proximity. And it's performance that allows actors to situate characters within a cultural and linguistic context. Gaelic is spoken in the context of the performance, and eventually it becomes a monolingual. By the end, it has become a monolingual play. And this world of performance, you could argue, is as real and stable, or as unreal and unstable, as the monolingual world of Mary's dementia. And I want to stress something here about this association between the linguistic reality of dementia from a sort of a medical perspective, as opposed to performance. And I don't want to be disingenuous when I'm using this association. And it's something I'm going to come back to in a moment, because I recognize that the metaphorical importance of loss and decline and so on can be highly problematic when we're talking about minority languages. So I'll return to that in a moment when I discuss metaphoric thinking. A second point I would say concerning the value of the workshop was that it proved the value of performance for presenting different research expertise in an accessible way and to audiences of diverse disciplinary backgrounds. One of the co-organisers, for example, is an expert on neurocognitive issues. And on the day, as I said, they were actors, they were medics, and so on. And the read-through of the play was a starting point for a multidisciplinary discussion and inquiry that allowed us to share our experiences and insights, to critique and even to envisage new possibilities. A third point, I think, is the multidisciplinary nature of the discussion was, I think, a reflection of the play's multi-perspective nature. So the play doesn't privilege any one perspective. There's a small role for a doctor who provides a professional take on Mary's condition. The character of a reverend gives us some indication of a broader community perspective. We see Mary's confusion and frustration, but we also see John's confusion and his sense of isolation. And we see William revealed by Mary's condition as the in-between family member, the son forced to translate literally the relationship between his parents, as Mary's disappearing bilingualism leads to a breakdown in communication. And beyond the specific Western Islands context of the play, the questions the read-through raised clearly resonated with those present who had travelled from out with Scotland. And of course, this gives the whole new counter-argument to the idea that Gaelic-speaking Scotland is remote. This performance raised a question, an issue about care that has to be tackled globally, I think. So if you could move on, Ingeborg, to the metaphoric approach, which is the thing that interests me in particular as somebody who works a lot on literature. I think that the play provided uncommonly rich insights into the metaphors, and we might also say, I suppose, the pathologies of decline, loss, and death that characterise so much debate on Gaelic in Scotland. As Susan Sontag notes in her influential 1978 essay, illness is not a metaphor. And the most truthful way of regarding illness and the healthiest way of being ill is one most purified of and most resistant to metaphoric thinking. In the context of dementia, and also in the context of Gaelic and its speakers in 21st century Scotland, those reservations must also apply, and they must remind us to be cautious and respectful. But like the territory of illness that Sontag is describing, and I'm paraphrasing her here, it's hardly possible to take up one's residence in the world of debates on Gaelic unprejudiced by the lurid metaphors with which it has been landscaped. For me, anyway, the play, with its explicit association of dementia with issues related to the health of Gaelic, requires us, or demands of us even, that we engage in metaphoric thinking. And the value of performance is that it leads us towards an elucidation of those lurid metaphors we use to speak of Gaelic, which are rooted in physical, bodily, and cognitive decay. So we may assume then that Mary's fate, as embodied in performance, will not recover. She's on a one-way journey somewhere and she's not turning back. And of course, metaphoric thinking also allows us to argue the play is saying the same thing about Gaelic within the family, and perhaps more broadly within the family of the nation. Mary will die, John will remain, capable only of speaking English to William, who in any case has uprooted himself and left his community. But the richness of metaphoric thinking triggered by the play can potentially also liberate us from interpreting things this way, this fatalistic way. Regardless of whether the monolingual Gaelic world of Mary's declining mind and body is real or not, her language is real and it is alive. It endures, it survives, and we hear it spoken in performance. Those of us who, like John, don't speak Gaelic are eventually locked out of the play's meaning. We too experience a loss, in this case, a loss of understanding, because we don't speak the language, but it's not an irreversible or an impossible situation. There are possibilities, the play suggests. There are solutions, there are choices. William leaves, but we don't know what linguistic reality he's going to. Will he, a father himself, transmit the mother tongue to his daughter, or ensure that at least she does not feel remote from the place and the culture where he spoke it first? Will John, the husband, decide to learn Gaelic? Will he opt to depend on interpreters and translators of anything Gaelic related, who will continue to invest in the language despite all the talk of loss and decline? So to conclude then, I would say that as researchers, well, I am certainly used to the expository text being privileged as the most objective and disengaged discursive form of communicating research. But I think what the project has shown us is that performance is uniquely capable of highlighting or of recovering, if you like, the immediacy of human experience that can be lost in the smooth abstractions of scholarly writing. It was accessible and relatable, the performance. It allowed, as I said, for an open discussion and exploration of the various aspects of socio-linguistic and political issues that apply to Gaelic, but also to other minority languages, or community languages as well, which was another issue that came up. And I think also that discussion of new possibilities and of comparing what's been done in other contexts was really helpful for thinking about how to move forward and how perhaps policy can be influenced by some of our research. And I think that's all I have to say on it for the moment. It's an ongoing project. It has been stalled by COVID, yeah, here's fingers crossed that we can keep going. Thank you.